Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here on this Saturday afternoon. As Jenny said, it's beautiful weather. It also doesn't help me that I'm following this particular lineup of speakers. So, forgive me if I feel a little bit tense right now, but hopefully you're all a little bit refreshed after this break and this coffee. So I'm not really going to take it easy on you. I'm just going to go right into a pop quiz. You're here. So what do the following things have in common? Gesture control, OXO good grips, kitchen tools, audiobooks, and electric toothbrushes. I welcome you to raise your hand and try to answer the question. Jenny will repeat your response. I see a hand over there in the corner.
They were invented
for accessibility purposes and then became more widely useful.
Yeah, first response. They were invented with accessibility in mind and then became really widely adopted.
That is exactly right. The answer is accidental scale. All of these products were invented with accessibility in mind. Gesture control, OXO good grips were invented because the couple who invented it, the wife had arthritis. Audiobooks are obvious, and electric toothbrushes were invented for people with mobility impairments. One more. What do the following things have in common? Yogibo beanbags, Otter.ai voice notes app, Apple Pay, and Google's Project Relate. This one is a tougher one, isn't it? Okay, I take it there are no takers. I did think this is a little bit tougher, but the answer is accidental accessibility. All of these products started off as mainstream consumer products or projects, and it turned out that every single one of these products had an accessibility benefit. Yogibo beanbags were created initially for gamers. They wanted to create beanbags that would be supremely comfortable for people to lie in for hours at a time, and turned out people on the autism spectrum, people with sensory issues, loved these beanbags. Otter.ai started off as just a voice-to-text note-taking app, and turned out the hard of hearing community, including myself, loved it. Apple Pay, easy for people who are blind or who have vision loss to use the terminal to pay. And Google's Project Relate is for atypical speech patterns, for voice recognition of atypical speech patterns. So, we've seen accidental scale and we've seen accidental accessibility. Can we have deliberate, scaled accessibility? All of the examples that we typically hear about when we talk about inclusive design, most of you here would be familiar with inclusive design. The examples that you hear, Velcro straps, electric toothbrushes, all of those, the mass market success of those products was an accident. Can we teach startups and entrepreneurs to be deliberate about that mass market potential? In the startup world, there's this concept of the chasm. What that means is that it's a bell curve. It starts off on the left-hand side with tech enthusiasts, innovators, and early adopters who start off by using the products in the very, very early stages. And then there's the chasm. That chasm is where most products fail, because they fail to go from the early adopter stage to the early majority or the mainstream market. This is a concept that's very common in the startup and innovation world. What does this mean in context of accessibility tech? When entrepreneurs, and I work with a lot of accessibility entrepreneurs, when they tell, let's say, investors that they are working on accessibility tech, investors quickly assume that people with disabilities are basically the early adopters. investors, again, I'm using investors as a placeholder, they assume that this is such a niche product that it will never be able to cross that chasm into the mass market stage and therefore achieve enough scale to be a successful product. So the question is, can accessibility products achieve scale? Why is it important, in fact? Why is it necessary for accessibility entrepreneurs or startups to have scale? And the answer is, if they don't target or achieve scale, it's harder to raise funding, whether from venture capital or from other sources that are not grants. When they're not able to convince people about their potential for scale, they often don't get admitted into mainstream accelerators, which is where a lot of the opportunities and networks become available. So can we solve for this? Well, I'll give you a spoiler alert because you have already seen the title of my talk. The answer lies, I believe, in inclusive design. I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with this graphic that's on the screen, which shows a starburst plot. It's the famous starburst plot from Jutta Treviranus, which talks about how in the center of the starburst plot, there is a very high density of small dots, and there is a circle surrounding that density of dots. Beyond that initial center, there is a more dispersed set of dots, and there is another circle around it. And at the very edges, there is a few very small amount of dots. This represents, according to Jutta Treviranus, at the center, design that is easy to use. Beyond that, at the moderately dispersed level, it represents design that is difficult to use, in this case for people with disabilities, let's say. And at the very end, the furthest out, are what Utah calls the extreme or edge use cases. That is where the design is basically impossible to use. There is a related concept here that Utah goes into, which, by the way, if you're not familiar with this, I highly recommend that you look it up and read it because you're going to love it. It's one of my favorite articles on this topic. It talks about the virtuous tornado, which says that you start iterating at the center, which is where, like general, not accessibility products, general products, start iterating at the center where the density is the highest. And from there, they try to expand to wider use cases and ultimately reach the accessibility use cases, which is the hardest thing to do. But what happens when it's accessibility tech? So before I go there, what I have on the screen right now is an arrow pointing out from the center leading to the words flexibility, because that is where Utah says you start building in the flexibility and then you go to the edge use cases towards the end. And there's arrows pointing from flexibility to edge use cases. So what happens to this chart when we think about accessibility tech? In case of accessibility tech, people who are creating accessibility technology, for them, the use case starts from the very outer edges. So then what do we do with this? How do we go further? How do we go to different use cases? That is the scalability problem in terms of inclusive design. Now, as Dr. Motion, I believe his name was, said, let's put a pin in this topic and come back to it. Are any of you familiar with the image that's on screen, which shows a clear container with a white lid on top with a button in the center? Is anybody familiar with this product? A few people, I see a few hands. This is the OXO easy open something container. It's basically a container that is very easy to open. It's got a button in the very center of the lid, and you can press down on it, which locks it. And then you press it again, the button pops up, and you can use that as a handle to lift open the lid of the container. I recently came across this product when I was in Florida visiting my brother, and it is the most boring product out there. It's just really simple, it's really stupid, and I fell in love with this product. And I'm not even kidding, I kept thinking about this product. That's because this product, if you think about it, is easy for my little niece to use, who typically finds it hard to seal airtight containers because they're just really hard. In this case, you can just press down on it. I have a partial paralysis in my left arm, and if I'm holding a drink in my right arm, there is no way I can use a regular container with an airtight lid. This one, I can just press down and pull it open. I loved it. My sister-in-law, my brother also has a younger baby, so my sister-in-law, I've seen her use this product with her infant in one hand and using the other hand to open the lid. The amount of use cases that this product has is mind-blowing. So now, let's go back to that, the Starburst plot in context of accessibility technology. Now you have this product that's created with accessibility use cases in mind at the very edge of this chart, the Starburst chart. From there, we went to, from arthritis, let's say, we went to an adjacent use case of somebody like me with partial paralysis in one arm. From there, we went to my niece, my sister-in-law, who are mass market consumers. This is what I believe to be the power of inclusive design and helping accessibility innovation go from the so-called niche use cases to answering that perennial scalability question in the world of accessibility entrepreneurship. Let me give you an example closer to home. VRAI OP, I have no idea what it stands for, don't ask me, is a very innovative product created by a graduate of the OCAD Inclusive Design program. In fact, this guy runs the startup called Sense Tech Solutions. And I'm going to do him justice and read out how he describes it. VRAI OP is a series of virtual reality simulations that utilize artificial intelligence that focus on job readiness training for people with and without sight loss. What does this mean? His technology is a VR app which allows people to use job readiness training in virtual reality and is accessible, and it provides feedback. It tracks users' body posture, such as the amount of leaning, eye contact engagement, and head orientation, including if you're tilting your head due to hearing loss or anxiety or whatever. So think about this. Think about the applications of this technology. If you start off with trying to create a product where people who can't visualize themselves in an interview setting, and it allows them to practice how they do in interviews and gives them feedback using AI. Think about how many use cases we can expand it to. I have hearing loss. I've been speaking with many of you today, and you might notice when I can't understand what you're saying, I might lean in or I might tilt my head, and that might not look the greatest in interviews. If you're under stress, for example, in an interview, you're anxious, you will again lean in, you'll be bending forward. This product may be able to give you feedback on that. It tracks users' speech for what's called string analysis, positive versus negative answers, tone recognition, which is happy, angry, sad, the speaking volume, and filler words like or things like that. So if you apply that inclusive design, think about all of the adjacent use cases they can expand to, and then I see no reason why this wouldn't be useful for the mass market. So let's come back to that chart of the chasm. Now here, if you apply everything that we've talked about so far, I say that on the left-hand side, where we had the early adopters, it begins with the leftmost side, beta testers and pilots. When you're developing a new accessibility product, you obviously want to co-design and co-create, and for that, you work with a lot of beta testers and pilots, and those are your very first set of users. And from there, again, before the chasm, you have people with disabilities, your edge use cases, your niche use cases. And then, can you apply inclusive design to go to adjacent markets? I'm going towards the right of this bell curve now, towards mainstream markets. So can you apply inclusive design to go to adjacent markets, and from there, the mass markets? Now, I'm not saying, I do want to acknowledge, I'm not saying that this is a catch-all solution. It's never going to be a catch-all solution. A lot of products are meant for people with disabilities and only to be used by people with disabilities. And I'm not saying that every single one of these products need to be scaled to the mass market, but a lot of them can and should be scaled to the mass market. A note of caution. I think it was Bryce in the beginning of the session who shared a screenshot of one of my favorite Twitter users, Liz Jackson. And Liz Jackson, for me, I don't think she knows me, but I'm a fan of hers. And Liz Jackson is probably the biggest critic of inclusive design that I've ever met. And the reason I really like her, because she always gives me a reality check, even though she doesn't know she's giving me a reality check. So in acknowledgement of that, I want to point out that inclusive design applied in this way should not forget affordability. If you're looking at mass market adoption, you shouldn't forget that your users in the disability market should be able to afford your product. You shouldn't forget availability. As Liz Jackson will tell you, there are more instances than I can count where large companies came up with, let's say, the Nike Fly Ease shoe, which was supposed to be a game changer for people with mobility impairments to be able to put on a shoe without having to bend down to tie your laces or anything, or even touch the shoe. But turned out that product was never available. It was always sold out. So you shouldn't forget actual availability of your product. And most importantly, and I cannot emphasize this enough, most importantly, you shouldn't forget the purpose of your product. When you're targeting a mass market, ultimately in some distant future, you shouldn't forget why you started off in the first place, which was to solve an accessibility problem. Always keep that story in your marketing and your use cases centered, and that's what will allow you to have the most accessible and most innovative products. And that is what we do at ATS Labs. ATS Labs is Canada's first accelerator for accessibility, mental health, and aging tech startups, and it is designed to help them scale by applying this very philosophy or this very thesis. Over the course of last years, we've been approached by more than a few organizations to ask us if we can do the same thing for them outside of the accessibility space. Historically, we turned them down because we just never had the time to do it. We are beginning to do it now by providing inclusive design programming to accessibility startups, but also to scale-ups and enterprise clients, as well as to organizations. Thank you for bearing with me. Let's talk.